The wind hits 60 miles an hour. The temperature has already fallen past minus 35 degrees Celsius, and the man crouched against the rock face has maybe 20 minutes before his body stops working the way it should. He has no cabin, no fire yet, just a hatchet, a wool blanket, and whatever the mountain gives him in the next few minutes. This is a Rocky Mountain blizzard in 1832, and for the trappers who wintered alone in these ranges, this exact moment, caught out, exposed, storm rolling in without warning, decided who walked out in spring and who didn't. These men weren't carrying insulated tents or synthetic layers. They had knowledge, most of it borrowed hard-won from the Crow, the Shoshone, the Blackfeet, and the Flathead people who'd survived these winters for generations before any trapper set a beaver trap in these valleys. And in the next few minutes, we're going to break down exactly what that knowledge looked like. The Terrain Rules, Chapter 1, 799 words. Every second he spends standing upright in that wind is a second his core temperature keeps dropping. And yet the first thing he does isn't build, it's look. Because before a mountain man ever laid a single log or packed a handful of snow, he had to answer one question that meant the difference between morning and never waking up. Where? This wasn't guesswork. By the 1820s and 30s, men like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and Hugh Glass weren't just trapping beaver in the Rockies. They were living through 6-7 months of winter isolation at a stretch, often alone or in pairs, far from any fort, far from the annual rendezvous where trappers traded furs and swapped stories each summer near the Green River. When that gathering broke up and the parties scattered back into the mountains, a man's survival came down to decisions made in the first hour of a storm, not the 10th. And the most critical decision was terrain. Here's what almost nobody realizes about winter camping in the high Rockies. The coldest place to sleep isn't the top of a ridge, and it isn't the bottom of a valley either. It's a trap either way. Ridgelines catch the full force of the wind, sometimes gusting past 60 miles an hour with nothing to slow it down, stripping heat off a man's body faster than his fire could ever replace it. But valley floors are just as deadly for the opposite reason. Cold air is heavier than warm air, and it sinks. It pools in low ground overnight like water filling a basin, which means the valley floor can actually sit several degrees colder than the slope just above it. A trapper who didn't understand that could build what looked like a perfectly sheltered camp and wake up, if he woke up at all, in the coldest pocket of air for miles. So where did they go instead? South-facing slopes, whenever the land allowed it. In the northern hemisphere, a south-facing hillside catches the sun at a steeper angle through the winter months, which meant even a pale, low winter sun could soften the snowpack, warm, exposed rock, and buy a shelter a few extra degrees that made the difference between manageable cold and killing cold. Combine that with a natural windbreak, a wall of rock outcrop, a dense stand of Douglas fir or lodgepole pine, and a man had the beginnings of a defensible position before he'd cut a single branch. And this is where the story most people tell about mountain men starts to fall apart. The popular image is a lone frontiersman, self-taught, conquering the wilderness through sheer grit. But grit doesn't teach you where cold air pools at 3 in the morning. That knowledge came from somewhere else. From the Crow, the Shoshone, the Blackfeet, the Flathead, peoples who had spent countless generations reading these same mountains through the same brutal winters. Mountain men who survived long-term, the ones whose names we still know, weren't operating on instinct alone. They were living alongside native communities, marrying into them, trading with them, and absorbing shelter knowledge that had already been refined over centuries. The half-faced camp, the snow-mound shelter, the choice of slope and windbreak. These weren't frontier inventions. They were borrowed survival science, passed hand to hand across a cultural line that history books often erase. Water mattered too, though not in the way you'd expect in the middle of a snowstorm. A camp near a creek or a spring meant a dependable source that wouldn't require hours of snow melting over a fragile fire. And it usually meant the terrain around it had already been shaped by generations of game trails and natural clearings, features a trained eye could read like a map. Proximity to timber wasn't just about firewood. Standing timber broke wind before it ever reached a shelter wall, and it also signaled something else useful: where the snowpack tended to drift, and where it tended to stay shallow enough to work with. None of this happened slowly. A trapper caught in open country when weather turned didn't have the luxury of scouting for an hour. He was reading slope angle, wind direction, and tree density in minutes, sometimes while the storm was already closing in around him, which is exactly the position our man against the rock face finds himself in. He's not panicking. He's calculating. Slope, wind, cover, water. 4 variables, 1 narrowing window of time. Because choosing the ground was only step 1. The moment he settles on this spot beneath the outcrop, the real construction begins. And what he builds next has to hold against wind that can tear it apart. Chapter 2, 826 words. Once the site is chosen, the clock doesn't stop. If anything, it speeds up. A man in the Rockies during a blizzard doesn't have the luxury of a slow, careful build. He has maybe an hour of usable strength before the cold starts stealing the fine motor control in his fingers. And after that, every task gets exponentially harder. So the decision he makes next is the one that decides whether he sees morning. There were 3 real options, and which one a trapper reached for depended entirely on what the land gave him. If he had timber and time, he built a half-faced camp, a lean-to with 3 walls angled to block the wind, left open on one side facing a fire. It sounds almost too simple to work, but the physics of it are exactly why it did. The open face wasn't a weakness, it was the design. Heat from the fire reflected off the angled back wall and pushed forward into the shelter, while the 3 solid sides broke the wind before it could strip that heat away. Men like Jim Bridger, who spent decades living in country that would kill an unprepared traveler in a single night, relied on this structure because it could be built fast, with materials that were almost always nearby: lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, whatever straight timber stood close enough to drag before his hands went numb. But timber wasn't always an option. Above the tree line, or in the middle of an open basin with a storm already rolling in, there was no half hour to spare gathering logs. And this is where something else comes into play. Something most people don't expect from grizzled fur trappers hardened by isolation. A huge amount of what kept these men alive didn't originate with them at all. It came from the Crow, the Shoshone, the Blackfeet, the Flathead, peoples who had generations of accumulated knowledge about surviving exactly this terrain, exactly this cold, long before a single European trapper set a beaver trap in the Rockies. Many mountain men lived alongside these tribes, married into them, learned from them directly. And one of the techniques they carried forward was the snow shelter, what we'd now call a quinsy. Pile snow into a mound, let it sinter and harden, hollow it out from the inside, and you're left with something that seems almost backwards. A shelter made entirely out of the same substance trying to kill you, that ends up keeping you alive because of it. Snow is an insulator. Trapped air inside packed snow barely moves, And that stillness is what holds body heat and fire heat inside instead of letting the wind carry it away into the dark. Then there's the option most people never picture at all: going underground. A dugout, cut into the side of a hill, uses the earth itself as three walls and a roof, with only the entrance exposed to the outside world. The ground insulates. It doesn't fluctuate with every gust the way open air does. A man who found a slope with the right composition could carve out a shelter that stayed measurably warmer than anything built above ground, simply because the earth around him held a steadier temperature than the storm ever could. So which one did he choose? That depended on what the land in front of him was actually offering. And this is where the rehook comes in, because the choice itself carried its own danger. Build a snow shelter wrong, without a ventilation gap, and you don't freeze. You suffocate, slowly, without ever realizing the air around you has gone bad. Build a half-faced camp without accounting for wind direction shift, something that happens constantly in mountain weather. And the fire that's supposed to save you starts filling your open shelter with smoke instead of heat. Every single option carried a hidden failure mode that had nothing to do with the cold at all. This is why chinking mattered so much in the cabins that were built for longer stays. Mud, clay, moss, sometimes mixed with animal hair, packed into every gap between logs. Not decorative, functional. Every unsealed crack was a place where wind could find its way in and undo hours of careful building in seconds. And this is why hides mattered too. Buffalo and elk skins draped over entrances and lining interior walls, borrowed directly from indigenous practice, adding a layer of thermal mass that raw log or packed snow alone couldn't provide. None of it worked in isolation. The terrain reading from before determined which shelter was even possible. The film. Shelter type determined what materials mattered, and the materials determined whether that fire, the one thing standing between a man and the cold, would actually keep him alive through the night, or become the very thing that killed him instead. Chapter 3. The frame is up. The lean-to's ribs of lodgepole pine are lashed and angled against the wind, and for a moment it looks like shelter. It isn't. Not yet. A skeleton of logs leaning against a rock face does almost nothing against 60-mile-an-hour wind and snow driving sideways. It breaks the worst of the gusts, but cold still pours through every gap like water through a sieve. The real work, the work that decides whether a man wakes up in the morning, hasn't even started. This is where mountain men borrowed something they didn't invent. Long before trappers like Jim Bridger or Jedediah Smith ever set a beaver trap in the Rockies, the Crow, the Shoshone, the Blackfeet, and the Flathead had already spent generations figuring out how to survive winters that killed the unprepared without mercy. Trappers who lived among these tribes, traded with them, sometimes married into them, picked up techniques that no fur company back east ever taught. And one of the most important lessons was this: air is the enemy, but trapped air is the friend. So the next layer isn't wood. It's pine boughs, armfuls of them, cut fast and packed thick, layered like shingles from the ground, up so water and wind slide off instead of soaking through. Underneath, on the floor of the shelter, more boughs go down before a man ever sits or lies on that ground. Bare earth in a Rocky Mountain winter will pull the heat straight out of a body faster than the air above it ever could. A layer of pine boughs between a man and the frozen dirt isn't comfort. It's the difference between hypothermia by morning and surviving until the storm breaks. Then comes the snow. Not as an enemy this time, but as insulation. Snow packed against the outer walls of the frame, tamped down hard, traps pockets of air inside its structure, the same way it does in an igloo or a quinsy mound built by native hunters further north. Snow is a strange material, deadly when it's falling and burying a man alive. But once it's packed and still, it becomes one of the best insulators available in the entire environment. A shelter walled in packed snow can hold body heat inside far better than an open lean-to ever could on its own. The storm itself, in a strange twist, hands over the exact material needed to survive it. But there's a problem. Seal a shelter too well, pack it too tight against every draft, and a man creates a second kind of death just as real as freezing, one that comes from the fire he lights to stay warm. Because fire, inside a nearly sealed shelter, is a gamble. Too small, and the cold still wins. Too large or badly placed, and smoke fills the enclosed space with nowhere to escape, or the fire eats through the oxygen faster than a small opening can replace it. Mountain men who overwintered alone in remote camps understood this balance wasn't optional. It was survival math. The fire had to be small, controlled, and positioned near an opening that let smoke escape without letting the wind roar in and undo everything the walls were built to stop. Some built their fires just outside the mouth of the shelter, close enough that reflected heat off the packed snow and rock walls bounced back inside, without ever bringing an open flame into a space with no ventilation. This is the part few people picture when they imagine winter survival in the 1800s, that the fire wasn't just about warmth, it was about precision. Too much heat, too fast, could even begin melting the packed snow walls that were holding the cold out in the first place, turning solid insulation into water, and water into a much faster route to hypothermia than the dry cold ever was. Every choice fed into every other choice. Nothing existed on its own. By the time the shelter was finished, boughs packed, snow walls tamped, fire carefully placed and tended, a man in the Rockies wasn't just hiding from the storm anymore. He'd built a small, fragile system, held together by nothing but timing, terrain, and borrowed knowledge, designed to keep his body just barely on the right side of survival, while 60-mile-an-hour wind screamed past a few feet away. And that system still had one more test to pass. Because a shelter that works for 1 hour, or even one night, isn't the same as a shelter that can hold through a 3-day blizzard, the kind the Rockies were known to drop without warning, burying camps and men alike under snow that didn't stop falling until it decided to. The build was done. The waiting, the version of survival no one talks about, was only just beginning. Chapter 4. What that skeleton needs now is mass. Not decoration, mass. Because a blizzard doesn't care how clever your angles are if the wind can still find its way through the gaps between the logs. And out here, in the high country, wind finds gaps the way water finds cracks in a dam. So the mountain man starts stripping pine boughs, breaking them down into thick, layered mats, and packing them into every seam of that frame, working from the ground up so each layer overlaps the one below it, the same way shingles shed rain. It's slow, deliberate work, and every minute he spends doing it is a minute he's not moving, not generating heat through motion, so his hands have to be fast even though the task demands patience. That tension between speed and precision is the whole game now. If he's traveled with the Crow or the Shoshone, or spent even a season trading alongside them, he knows the boughs alone won't be enough. This is where hide comes in. Buffalo, elk, whatever he's got stretched and cured from the fall hunt, draped over the leeward side of the shelter like a second skin. The fur traps a layer of still air against the boughs, and that still air is the real insulation, not the hide itself, not the branches themselves, but the dead space between them where heat can't easily escape and cold can't easily push through. It's the same principle native peoples had refined over countless winters before a single fur trapper ever set foot in the Rockies. And the men who survived out here weren't the ones who ignored that knowledge. They were the ones who borrowed it, fast, and made it their own. Then comes snow. Not as an afterthought, but as the final structural layer, packed hard against the outside of the hide and boughs until the whole shelter starts to look less like a lean-to and more like a drift that just happens to have a man inside it. Snow, packed correctly, becomes its own kind of armor, dense enough to block wind completely, breathable enough that a man inside won't suffocate. And it's this exact principle that plains and mountain tribes had already mastered with Quincy-style mounds long before any trapper adapted the technique for a hillside lean-to. Get the snow too thin, and the wind finds a way through anyway. Pack it too thick without ventilation, and you've built a tomb instead of a shelter. The margin between those two outcomes is thinner than most people realize, so the shell is finished. But a shell alone doesn't keep a man alive at minus 35 degrees Celsius. It just keeps the wind off him while the cold slowly does its work anyway. He still needs heat. And this is where the real danger of the whole build reveals itself. The danger nobody talks about when they picture some rugged frontiersman warming his hands by a roaring fire. Because a fire built wrong, inside a shelter this enclosed, doesn't warm a man. It kills him, slowly, quietly. Through smoke he can't smell accumulating in a space too small to let it escape. So the fire has to be small, almost stingy. Just enough coals to radiate heat without producing the volume of smoke a bigger blaze would throw off. Positioned near the entrance rather than buried deep inside, so there's a path for smoke to drift out before it pools. Mountain men learned to manage a shelter fire the way a surgeon manages a scalpel. Not for size, not for spectacle, but for precise, controlled effect. A gap left at the top of the structure, even a small one, lets bad air rise and escape while the heat from the coals still lingers low, where the man's body actually needs it. It's a balance that has to be watched all night, adjusted, tended, because a single wrong move, sealing the shelter too tight, feeding the fire too much fuel, falling asleep without checking the airflow, turns the exact thing built to save his life into the thing that ends it. This is the part most people miss when they imagine mountain men surviving the Rockies. It wasn't just enduring the cold. It was managing two threats at once, inside a space barely big enough to lie down in. The freezing wind trying to get in from one side, and the invisible poison of his own fire creeping toward him from the other. Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, men who spent entire winters alone in country like this, didn't survive because they were fearless. They survived because they understood that the shelter itself could become as dangerous as the storm outside it if a single detail was ignored. The pine boughs are packed, the snow is banked, and somewhere inside that dark, cramped shell, a small fire is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Not roar, not blaze, just breathe, low and steady, keeping one man alive through a night that wanted to kill him. This is what separated the trappers who came home from rendezvous with a season's worth of furs from the ones whose names only survive in someone else's journal. Not luck, not toughness alone. Knowledge, half of it borrowed from the Crow and Shoshone and Flathead peoples who'd been reading these mountains for generations before Bridger or Coulter ever set a trap line. The storm outside doesn't stop. It never does. Not for hours yet. But inside, the equation has changed. Wind that would have killed him in the open is now just noise against a wall of packed snow and green pine. That's the whole secret the Rockies demanded of these men. Not conquering the cold, just outlasting it, one carefully built shelter at a time.